Hey, what's up, everyone? This is thought of the day number 4. As I've probably told you in previous videos, I've been wanting to do more content in English. I just haven't had the time, or maybe to take full ownership of it, I just haven't prioritized it enough. I just did a little thought of the day on that same topic in French a few minutes ago, earlier today, and so I thought that's probably a good one for everybody to wrestle with. So I thought I would do it in English as well. So the topic of today's thought of the day is, what is zone 2? Everybody talks about zone 2 training, zone 2 method. What is zone 2? How do we define this training zone, and what does it mean? So first, I'll back up a little bit. We'll get to the zones. But before I want to talk about zones, I want to talk about intensity domains, because I think that's just the physiological basis for the zones. And as my friend Jem Arnold said very astutely, domains are descriptive and zones are prescriptive. So what that means is that intensity domains describe what happens at a physiological level. We can discriminate between different intensity domains by looking at different physiological responses and comparing them. And you can see distinct patterns in the different domains. For example, if you look at lactate response, so blood lactate, you would see values that are close to or equal to resting levels in the moderate intensity domain. You would see elevated levels of lactate in the heavy intensity domain, yet fairly stable usually. And then in the severe intensity domain, you would see an exponential rise in lactate until the person reaches task failure. If you look at VO2, you would have a steady state. Shortly after the beginning of the effort in the moderate intensity domain, you would see a slow component, so kind of a delay in the stabilization of the VO2 response in the heavy intensity domain, and then you would see a continuous rise of the VO2 response in the severe intensity domain until somebody reaches their VO2 peak / VO2 max and close to task failure as well. So those are physiological responses, and we can differentiate between those intensity domains by looking at those different responses. And the boundary between those different domains are called thresholds. So you've probably heard the term threshold before. There's many different thresholds. We can look at different physiological systems to assess those inflection points. They're not absolutes. They are dynamic. They move with fatigue. They move with the environment. What I mean by that is like external and internal environment. So if it's hotter, if the athlete's nutritional hydration status changes, fatigue, like I said, all those things impact thresholds. So we should see them as boundaries that help us discriminate between different intensity domains, but not fixed boundaries. They are going to change slightly from day to day, and they're going to change, we hope so, at least immensely over training years, because that's one of the targets of any type of conditioning work, is going to be to move those values ideally up. Ideally up. There's very few cases where you'd want them to come down. So now let's talk about zones. We have domains. We have our intensity domains, moderate, heavy, and severe. There's also the extreme domain a little bit farther, but we're not going to talk about it today. And now we're going to use the term zones to essentially break up those three intensity domains a little bit more precisely to help us prescribe training. Like Jem said, domains are descriptive of our physiology, and zones are prescriptive for training. And there are people using a 3-zone model, which I'm not super fond of, simply because we have the term domains that describes exactly what this is supposed to describe. And so in my mind, if you talk about a polarized training model, don't use the term zones because it confuses everyone. Just say domains, because again, this is what you're actually measuring from a physiological standpoint. And then if you want to put zones on top of that, you can have 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 zones. Usually the bottom 5 are always the same, and then some models account for the higher intensities and add some more training zones, but usually you'll have zone 1, active recovery, zone 2, which I'm going to come to in a second, which is usually the base endurance training zone. That's where most endurance athletes are going to spend most of their training hours. Sometimes with higher level athletes, they're going to actually spend more time in zone 1, simply because zone 2 is so high for them in absolute numbers that the demands on the body imposed by prolonged efforts in their zone 2 would be unsustainable, and they wouldn't be able to accumulate as much volume as if they just lowered the intensity a bit and trained in zone 1. So zone 1 and zone 2 are in the moderate intensity domain. Zone 2 being just before the first threshold that I talked about before, that discriminates between the moderate intensity domain and the heavy intensity domain. And I asked this on Twitter recently, and I didn't get a good answer. I don't think there's any valid, if we even look for valid, way to discriminate between zone 1 and zone 2. In my mind, it's a spectrum more than it is a clear break between zone 1 and zone 2. And like I said, the proof, it's not the right term, but I'll use it anyway because I don't have a better one right now. The proof in my mind that this is true, that it's a spectrum more than categorically different zones, is simply that again, those high level cyclists. If you look at Niels van der Poel, the speed skater who was doing immense volumes of low intensity training, well, he was doing it around 260 watts. His first threshold is probably in the 350s, 330 to 350, I would probably assume. And if you have more accurate information than me on this, please correct me in the comments below. So 260 is maybe bottom of zone 2, maybe top of zone 1. Again, how do you discriminate between those? I don't think we necessarily should. But that's where those zone 1 and 2 are, moderate intensity domain. And I'll run up the ladder quickly and come back to zone 2 to talk about it a bit more. Zone 3 is usually called tempo, which is usually from first, at the bottom of zone 3 is the first threshold. Top of zone 3 is usually close to the second threshold, so maybe 90% of the second threshold. That's usually the value that is agreed upon. Zone 4 is threshold, and there's obviously a gray area there, a gray zone between markers such as MLSS and markers such as critical power. So we need a bit of leeway there. Between 90 and 105% of critical power is usually what is defined as threshold. Some people use something else than critical power to define that second threshold. And then zone 5 is going to be VO2 max. So it's essentially superimposed on the severe intensity domain. And then if you want to add more zones, then we're talking about zone 6, sometimes zone 7, if we want to talk about kind of more neuromuscularly inclined type of training or super maximal efforts. So that's what I've been using recently, is essentially zone 7 is going to be super maximal work. So anything up to 30 seconds of all out effort. And then zone 6 is going to be anything between the top of zone 5 and the bottom of zone 7. So they're sustained efforts, but they're not super maximal. It's an arbitrary way of defining that, so you might have a better way or a different way, which is fine. As long as you're clear on what your different zones mean, I think it's fair game on that higher level. So zone 2, let's come back to zone 2. We've defined zone 2 as being as having an upper boundary in the first threshold and a lower boundary which is not clear at all, which is that transition zone 1, zone 2. Again, in my mind, it's more of a spectrum, so I don't even know if we need to worry about a bottom of zone 2, so much as we need to worry about how much volume are you accumulating in that area. And the more volume you have to accumulate or you can accumulate, the lower that should be relative to the top of zone 2. Maybe that's one way of talking about it. And why do we want to train in zone 2? Why is it so important? Why do so many people talk about it? because there's a lot of adaptations that occur in that intensity spectrum that don't occur anywhere else. And the big ones that come to my mind are the metabolic efficiency through fat oxidation. So we know that when lactate starts to rise, fat oxidation, there's lactate rising, there's catecholamines being released or adrenaline being released as intensity rises, and that is going to dampen, it's going to reduce the release and utilization of free fatty acids. So essentially, you want to keep the intensity below that first threshold in order to maximize the amount of fat that you're going to be able to burn. And so you're going to, or utilize, and you're going to become more metabolically efficient as you are able to use more fats as fuel. And so that's going to be one of the development from a metabolic standpoint. You're going to probably learn to reutilize lactate quite a bit, even though that's probably usually assigned to zone 3. But if you're in the top of zone 2, lactate is still being produced, but you're just reutilizing it at a fast enough rate that it's not manifesting as an increased in lactate levels in the blood. I might be wrong on that. I'd be fine with that, so I'm not 100% confident on that one. But beyond that, increased mitochondrial density, increased capillary density, increased vasodilator capacity, so the ability to essentially open up the pipes and just let more blood through, and thus more oxygen. We know that critical power, for example, is highly correlated to capillary density of type 1 fibers. And so we obviously want a maximum amount of oxygen being able to reach our tissues so that we can sustain whatever effort we're doing for longer or maybe at a higher intensity. So all these are very important, and those would be more the peripheral adaptations. There's central adaptations from a cardiac output standpoint as well, central adaptations from an autonomic standpoint as well. There's a parasympathetic dominance in that intensity of training, which means better balance in your autonomic nervous system, especially if you're used to doing a lot of high intensity. One of the things I've seen again and again prescribing zone 2 to the athletes that I work with is just better sleep, better recovery, tolerating volume better. So fatigue resistance is another property that you're going to develop through that low intensity training. And like I said, the load on the nervous system is very low, and so you can accumulate a lot of volume without accumulating too much fatigue, if any fatigue at all. That really depends, because obviously if you're doing 35 hours of zone 1 per week, you're going to have some fatigue that accumulates from that. I'm not saying the opposite, but for someone who's already training maybe 10 hours a week, I don't know, something like CrossFit, for example, well, adding 2 hours of low intensity training is not going to make you more tired. It's probably actually going to do the opposite and allow you to recover better and tolerate better all the volume that you're already doing and the high intensity that you're doing. So, and that's just talking about the performance side, not mentioning the health benefits of having better metabolism. I did a testing session with an ultra cyclist a couple months ago, and we recalibrated his zone 2, because one of the biggest problems is people doing their zone 2 work outside of their zone 2, so in zone 3, because they don't actually know their first threshold. They haven't measured it, and so they don't know how to control their intensity. And they go by feel, and they think, 10 watts more, what's that going to make as a difference? Well, it can mean the difference between being in the right internal metabolic environment or not. And you need to be in that correct, or how to say that, you need to be in the right internal metabolic state if you want those adaptations to occur. And so it's really important to calibrate that zone 2 properly, which we did with that cyclist. He went out, obviously he had some time to train, and he did some probably 2 to 3 long sessions per week, 5+ hours. And within 2 months, he moved his first threshold 15 watts. So he could ride 15 watts more at the same heart rate, and before his lactate curve started to go up. And his absolute lactate numbers, even though we know those can be influenced by many things, his absolute lactate numbers dropped by 0.5. So he was at maybe 1.1, 1.2 at baseline before, and now he's more in the 1.6, 1.7, and he's a type 1 diabetic, and he dropped his insulin intake by 40% in 2 months. Not my words, his. So if you had any doubts about zone 2 regarding performance, I hope that what I've explained makes sense in terms of the benefits and the utility of this kind of training, and that everybody should consider integrating it year round. And obviously the intensity or the volume is going to depend a lot on many things in your training, but everybody should do some amount of it. And for the health benefits, well, it's clear to me now, having heard that feedback from this athlete, that it can have a huge impact on how your body functions. And I mean, I've seen it as well with my wife, who's had chronic fatigue problems for some time now, and just getting on the bike 3 or 4 days a week, even for 20 or 30 minutes, well, that's made a huge difference in how she feels, how she recovers. So it's really applicable across the board. I think from a and I've seen many athletes now, CrossFitters and others, that are fit, that look great, lots of muscle mass, can throw down some serious numbers on the intensity side, but then from a metabolic standpoint, just they don't have any kind of development that's been done there. And it's obviously not their sport, but for me, it's just a rock that hasn't been flipped over, and it's development potential that's just left on the table, and that's just sad, right? Because you're doing all that hard training to try and get better, but you've probably hammered at that for some months, maybe some years. So we know that you get diminishing returns by applying the same stimuli over and over again. So sometimes just by adding a different stimuli, like that low intensity training, like 1 or 2 hours a week, can make a huge difference. And so I think that's probably why it's popular is probably not the term that I would use. I don't like this term anyway. That's why it's a topic that's coming up so much. I think people are just realizing after the last, I don't know what it's been. Has it been 10 years, 15, 20 years that now intensity has been all the craze, and HIIT is the way to go, and sprint intervals are the way to get fit because it takes a fraction of the time of doing the long stuff. But again, the adaptations are not the same. You don't get the same adaptations from the high intensity work. Does it have maybe a similar carryover to things like VO2 max and other markers? It probably does, yes, because for somebody who's mildly fit or unfit, doing sprint interval training is going to raise their VO2 max, is going to make them fitter, but it doesn't mean it's going to make their metabolism more efficient and their ability to oxidize fats better and their ability to recover better. All those things are not necessarily true at the same time. So I think that's why Zone 2 has been talked about so much and still is being talked about. And I think it's a good thing because really you don't need much. And the way I like to explain or to think about it is that Zone 2 is not going to make you better at your sport. But Zone 2 is going to allow you to do more specific training for your sport. And this is going to transfer to competition results. That's the way I like to think about it. So it's the base to your specific training, which then carries over to your results. So it's one step removed. So you shouldn't think about, but my sport is not at that intensity, but my sport doesn't last 2 hours. Those are not considerations that you should have when you're talking about general physical qualities that you're trying to develop. They're general in nature. They're non-specific. And so specificity is king, obviously, but that doesn't mean you can completely neglect your general athlete development and just do the specific stuff. You need to be an athlete first and then a specialist second. And I think this is the best way to succeed long-term in any sporting disciplines. So here you go. I've gotten to the end of my little Zone 2 thoughts. Let me know what you think. If you have any comments or corrections to bring, please do so in the comments below. Leave a like if you appreciate the content. Always a pleasure to chat with you guys. And I guess I'll see you in the next video. Take care.